Hello, and welcome to the ONTIC Protective Intelligence Podcast. I'm Fred Burton with the ONTIC Center for Connected Intelligence. During my years as a counterterrorism agent with the U.S. State Department and time spent as a physical security expert in the private sector, I've seen it all and met many fascinating people along the way. This podcast series explores the riveting world of safety, security, and protection through conversations with leaders in the field. I'm Fred Burton, and now on to the podcast. Hi, I'm Fred Burton, here today with Annie Jacobsen. Annie is the author of the Pulitzer Prize finalist in history, The Pentagon's Brain, the New York Times bestsellers Nuclear War, Area 51, and Operation Paperclip, and other books. She was a contributing editor at the Los Angeles Times Magazine and a graduate of Princeton University. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and two sons. Annie, welcome to the ONTIC Protective Intelligence Podcast.
Fred, thank you for having me.
Wow, Annie, I finished your book in like a day and a half. It's probably the best nonfiction book that I've read this year. So it's a wonderful job, but I got to tell you, it's pretty scary. Tell us a little bit about nuclear war.
Well, thank you for that intro, Fred. And, I wanted to write a book that showed in appalling detail just how horrific nuclear war would be. And I get the sense, based on reader reviews, that I may have accomplished that.
No doubt, no doubt. Having spent time with the Secret Service and the State Department, I actually learned a few things from reading your book that I never knew about. So it was simply amazing. Now, Annie, what advice would you give our listening audience about contingency planning? Meaning, we have a lot of folks in the security space that listen to this podcast. And the one takeaway I got from reading your book is that speed of response seems to be critical. Is that correct?
Yes and no. And here's why. So for listeners, and obviously there are, as you say, educated listeners here, I learned very quickly, and let me back up, a preconception I had, having reported on nuclear weapons, somewhat in my earlier 6 books. Always, nuclear weapons is, of course, always a thread in any story about war and weapons and U.S. national security and secrets post-World War II. This is the world in which we live. But I had been under the impression that there were kind of 2 parallel lanes. There's the lane of nuclear war unfolding should it happen, and then the lane of protecting the government so that the government can continue to function. And I know that from having reported on civil defense programs in the 1950s. But what I was shocked to learn, Fred, based on really your question, to answer your question, what I learned based on primarily on an interview I did with President Obama's FEMA director for 8 years, Craig Fugate, was that this lane of protection, this lane of keeping the government going, this lane of keeping the citizenry safe in the event of nuclear war, essentially collapses in minutes.
Wow.
Minutes. And so when you ask me what can be done, not much. And I can get a little more specific on that, depending on where you want to go with this.
Annie, the impact to the continental United States would be catastrophic, is the one takeaway that resonates loudly in your book, Nuclear War. However, what would be the ramifications to other countries in North America like Canada or Mexico as a result of this?
So the sort of obvious truth about nuclear weapons, which people inside the nuclear weapons apparatus know, and the rest of us kind of don't know until we either read my book or spend several years investigating it, is that a nuclear war happens in seconds and minutes, not in days and weeks. And this is because an intercontinental ballistic missile takes approximately 30 minutes to get from one continent to the next. A sub-launched ballistic missile lands in under 10 minutes, in essence. And so what happens to the other countries? Well, I think a big takeaway of the book is that we're all going to die. And I don't say that as a euphemism. I mean that quite literally, because that is what I learned. Nuclear war, if it happens, is set up in such a manner that no nuclear war is limited. This was a big takeaway I learned from Washington, D.C. And another way of saying it is there's no such thing as a little nuclear war. And these are from war game scenarios that the government has been conducting since the 50s. So jump to the 72 minutes after the war begins, and you now have thousands of nuclear missiles landing on, in my scenario, the continental United States and Russia and North Korea. The rest of the world is going to suffer the nuclear winter with everyone else. And so you're going to have, after all of the fires are burning from the nuclear blast, something like 330 billion pounds of soot lofted into the air that will block out 70% of the sun and will lower the global temperature of the earth between something like 27 degrees and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So you will have the death of agriculture. And with the death of agriculture, you have the starvation of what is now modeled out to be 5 billion people. So no, Mexico is not going to be a good place to go. No, Canada is not going to keep you safer. In fact, as I learned from Professor Brian Toon, one of the original 5 authors with Carl Sagan of the nuclear winter theory in the early 1980s, is that probably the only places where agriculture can survive and thrive would be Australia and New Zealand.
I know that the TikTok in your book provides a wonderful back and forth as to everything that takes place between the U.S. entities involved with trying to evacuate our leadership to safe havens. So for protectors, for those of us that are in this kind of space, Annie, is it possible that you could cover and evacuate your CEO or VIP in time of one of your major corporations in America?
So let's drill down on that for a second. You would, if you assume that the people being protected are somehow one phone call away from someone in nuclear command and control, or someone at the White House that could make that phone call to let you know, right? So you'd have to begin with that. And we're talking about in the first few minutes of nuclear launch, which is plausible if you are, if you're protecting the president's grandmother. Obviously, you're going to be part of this, or the president's mother. If you are on a Secret Service team, if you're on 1 degree away from that, you would begin to move. You would move your asset, no doubt. So there's 2 things to think about at this point that FEMA would be working on. There's 2 programs: the continuity of government, which is the government keeping, the line of succession safe, so that somebody can become commander in chief in the event Washington is hit, the president dies, and the people in the line of succession die. There's that lane. And then there's what's called continuity of operations program, or otherwise known as the program. And that is to keep essential functions going. And that's really what FEMA would be in charge of. So if the person you're protecting is in either of those lanes, by all means, you would move them out. The question is, where are you going to safety? And okay, so then jump way forward to this idea that you do have access either to a private bunker or a smaller government bunker that's not a target like the Pentagon, like the bunker under Stratcom, like Raven Rock. And you can get your asset there. What you have to think about is that I learned this sort of jaw-dropping fact from an interview I did with General Toohill, who was the cyber chief, America's first cyber chief. And he explained to me how all military bases run on generators. All generators are either fuel-based or connected, and the system that the generators are hooking up to is connected to the grid. And so when the grid goes down and the fuel runs out and the fuel can't be pumped anymore, everyone has to come out of their bunker. And then you have that ... because what are you coming out to?
So, in essence, I'm sitting back as an old protection hand thinking, would escape from America be possible via alternative methods of travel? Let's say you could get your Gulf Stream in the air, or if you had your boat to be able to escape from some pier. But in essence, where would you go?
Where would you go? How would you get to either, South America? Because it was also mentioned that probably the tip of, Argentina would have agriculture. I mean, and the concept of the nuclear winter and where agriculture might survive and thrive comes, by the way, not from like guesstimates as they did in the 80s, but rather on very computer-based climate modeling to really identify these weather patterns. And so how would you get your asset to those places? You know better than I how extraordinarily difficult that would be. On top of the fact that if you're airborne, you're not going to have any air traffic control working. And I'm talking about working after, on minute 73, certainly of my scenario. So how far have you gotten in minute 73?
Yeah, you think logistically of just how difficult it is to move a CEO and to try to react in minutes. Literally, it's extraordinarily challenging. Well, let me ask you a question, Annie. You obviously are the expert now in this space, good, bad, or indifferent. And if I had to ask Annie Jacobsen, where would you go? Where would you run to if you had money was no object, or accommodations, were anywhere you could be?
So I'm going to turn that question around, because that's not my brain. Call me an optimist, which I am. My brain doesn't want to think in terms of preparation for the Holocaust, the nuclear Holocaust that would certainly come after a nuclear exchange. My brain wants to go to, you know what, Fred, thanks for the compliment. I'm an expert in telling a story about a scenario of a nuclear war. I'm an investigative journalist and I'm a storyteller. And there are so many experts in deterrence, the military concept of deterrence, and in the concept of disarmament. And what I would like to throw back at you as a question is more of what can be done to prevent ever having to think about how you would save your own rear end if a nuclear war came. Because also what comes to mind is the quote by Nikita Khrushchev that said, after a nuclear war, the survivors would envy the dead.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, Annie. And, I know that we have hordes of officials in Washington and around the world trying to keep their finger on this pulse and focusing on deterrence. But it seems like the race to acquire nuclear arms is something that has always been there, going back to the Cold War. Heck, I can remember as a kid practicing going under my desk in elementary school, during the Kennedy administration. Annie, it's hard to not focus on the Middle East at this moment in time with all the chaos and the war in Gaza and so forth. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know your thoughts on the Iranian nuclear program. Did you come across anything in the course of putting this together?
So if we back up for a second and think about how this all began, there and then I'm going to go to where we are today. So, and this is the short version of it. But when you think about when this nuclear arms race began, there were only two superpowers. That's how it was structured. Deterrence, like the basic idea that I'm going to have a massive nuclear arsenal and I'm going to point all my weapons at you, Russia, and don't you dare think about launching or we'll all die. And that's why the other side has an arsenal of nuclear weapons too. And that's the fundamental idea of deterrence. But initially, the idea was nuclear weapons were there so that nuclear war could be fought and won. And I show the reader the original plans for the PSYOP. That was the original plan for general nuclear war. And you can see in horrific detail that, 600 million Russians would be killed in that first U.S. preemptive strike. And that is a idea that quickly became replaced by, okay, we can never have a nuclear war because it would be too horrific. And over the decades, we've gone from those two nuclear armed superpowers to having 9. We have 9 nuclear armed nations. Iran is not yet one of them. And when I think of my interview I did with Richard Garwin, who drew the first plans for the first thermonuclear weapon ever exploded, and I asked Garwin what he was most afraid of, and he told me the Mad King scenario, which would be a madman with a nuclear weapon. And for that reason, I chose to, in nuclear war scenario, have the scenario begin with a North Korean leader launching a nuclear weapon at the United States in that kind of Mad King scenario. So to answer your question about Iran, it would be very difficult for me to see a mullah, an Iranian mullah with a nuclear weapon, as anything other than falling into Richard Garwin's Mad King scenario. The logic there is not a logic that makes comprehensive sense to those of us in the West, and perhaps even to our adversaries in Russia or China. And so to the thought of adding more rogue nations with nuclear weapons into this already incredibly volatile mix is terrifying. I'm going to quote UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said recently, "We are one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear Armageddon." He said this is madness and we must reverse course. Reversing course means having less nuclear armed nations, less nuclear weapons, not more.
Well, very well said. And for those that are listening to this podcast in the protection space, I would encourage you to read Nuclear War by Annie Jacobsen. Annie, is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to say?
It's always such a pleasure to talk to you, Fred. You and I go back, 14 years. I remember when I was writing Area 51, and I would sometimes call you up as a sounding board because you had so much wisdom and experience in the world, that world, which was new to me 14, 15 years ago. And so it's really a pleasure to be talking to you here now, with both of us continuing to write books and think about these national security issues which impact all of us.
Well, you're very kind, Annie, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today.
Thank you so much, Fred, for having me.
This episode was brought to you by the ONTIC Center for Connected Intelligence. Learn more at ontic.co/center. Again, that's ontic.co/center. It was produced by A.J. McKeon. Our music is a track called Monteverdi Ride and was written by Brian Bristow and performed by Smokin' Novas. Check them out on Spotify. Please remember to rate and review our podcast on iTunes and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions, we'd love to hear them. You can reach us at podcasts@ontic.co or visit ontic.co/center for more information. Thanks for listening.